scaffolding as the implication, not just in the early education, but it has, as Daniel mentioned, the implication of scaffolding as you move towards higher education in your career choices. The idea that confidence plays a role in how we make our educational choices. And to that's why we brought in Fiona Deller. And Fiona works with the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario. And it's just very important that what we do is when we look at education at the early years, we keep in mind that education in the early years has an implication, obviously, for the later years. And we have to make sure that we have the trajectory appropriately set, associated with the capabilities of the individual child. So that we are, if we have an effort to remediate, we remediate. If we have an effort to direct, we can direct. But we should be directed in the direction that is beneficial to their outcomes. And I think that what we'll hear from Fiona is a little bit is a little bit more about what outcomes are. So, yeah, Fiona, you can do this here. So I'll do a brief introduction of Fiona, who she is. But Fiona Deller is the Executive Director, Policy and Partnerships at the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, where she focuses on knowledge mobilization, research impact, and partnership building. Prior to coming to HEQCO, Fiona worked as the Post-Secondary Education Coordinator at the Council of Ministers of Education Canada, where she focused on federal and provincial and territorial relations in post-secondary quality assurance, government funding of post-secondary education, student financial assistance, and credit transfer, among others. Fiona also teaches program evaluation at the School of Politics and Public Administration at Ryerson. Thank you, Fiona.
Yeah. All right, so this is going to be a little bit different. We're going to go kind of meta. We're going to go into sort of core competencies, learning outcomes, what we mean by them in higher education when we talk about them. So I'm going to start by sort of talking a little bit about how we articulate learning outcomes and core competencies. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know in terms of the assessment of core competencies and learning outcomes. And then I'm going to make a bit of a plea for the bridge between the two sectors, K-12 and post-secondary, in terms of how we talk about core competencies, learning outcomes, and why that's important. I just want to say I've enjoyed thoroughly the conversation up until now. As a parent of a child who has struggled with mental illness and the school system in relation to mental illness, it's been very, very interesting. So I'm a little emotional right now. So I gave you a pun, you see, minding the gap, right there. Okay, so let's talk first a little bit about language. What do we mean when we say core competencies? If you ask a group of people in the post-secondary world what we mean when we talk about core competencies, we use, usually when I do this kind of presentation and I talk to faculty or people or registrars or senior administrators, and I ask them for their core competencies, they say things like critical thinking, problem solving, teamwork, numeracy, literacy, technology, working in technology-rich environments. There are a couple of others, but at a certain point you get to a saturation point, right? We have all sorts of different language for talking about these, but basically there are about half a dozen key concepts that we use when we talk about core competencies. And when we talk about learning outcomes, what we're talking about is what a student should be able to do and know based on those core competencies. So there's lots of different, there's lots of activity right now in the post-secondary world in terms of articulating core competencies and learning outcomes. The EU, the OECD are both sort of taken with this idea of, especially with faculty getting involved in the activity of articulating core competencies and learning outcomes. There are a number, I'll let you just read that. There are a number of, so that's the college, if you're from a college, that's the essential employability skills. That is the wonderfully named American Learning Expectations and America's Promise, LEAP, which I love. That is the Ontario Qualifications Framework that sets out the learning expectations for different credentials. That's the Lumina Foundation in the States, that's their degree qualifications profile. And that is, I believe, that's the UDLs, the University Learning Outcomes and Core Competencies. And the point is that these activities have all come from different places historically, culturally, they have different goals, but they all basically come to the same place in terms of what the core competencies and learning outcomes should be. I just wanted to give you one example of that. We did this, it's actually a pilot research project that took about 2 years. It was called a tuning project. The name comes from the similar process that the EU went through. And we asked faculty in 3 different discipline clusters. So in the social sciences, in the life and health sciences, and in the physical sciences to meet once a month and to define what the core competencies and learning outcomes in their discipline cluster was. And what we found after about a year was that they came to it from very, very different places. So, of course, the engineers and the sociologists developed learning outcomes very differently, as you can imagine. And to be a fly on the wall in those meetings was very, very interesting, actually. But what we found after about a year was that they were all coming up with essentially the same core competencies and learning outcomes. So it didn't matter what discipline they came from, they were coming to the same place at the end of the day. So they were knowledge, critical and creative thinking, communication, social responsibility, personal and interpersonal skills, and then there was a 6th that we added, which was specific to that discipline area, practice and methods specific to that discipline area. And if you break it down by core sub-competencies, you can see all the literacy, writing skills, numeracy, creativity, curiosity, problem solving, all the things that you would imagine would be there, and then eventually what the learning outcomes should be based on these core competencies. So essentially, what we're talking about is a body of competencies that everybody essentially agrees on, despite the fact that we come from different discipline places, different regional backgrounds, different historical reasons for doing this. Traditionally, in post-secondary education, there have been a variety of reasons for articulating core competencies in learning outcomes. The oldest reason that we have in Ontario is quality assurance and accreditation, right? So it's just basically been about articulating the learning outcomes and core competencies and mapping them to curriculum. So there have been accountability, credit transfer, employer understanding, especially in colleges, curriculum development, including continuous improvement, assessment, and accreditation. And for the assessment piece has been, it's relatively new at the system level. Formative assessment, of course, has been going on forever. Formative assessment of generic core competencies is, at the system level, is something that we're just sort of starting to talk about now. The colleges, I have to say, are much more advanced in this than the universities. The colleges have been doing this for a really long time, in large part because the colleges deal directly with employers, their community, and they have to have those conversations on a fairly regular basis. What we're teaching our students is that actually meaningful in the field in a very responsive and direct way. Universities are just starting to have these sort of same conversations. Some universities like Guelph are much farther along than others. So let's talk a little bit about assessment. So as I said, formative assessment is it's sort of like a million points of light. There are about 1 million really interesting little formative assessment pilot projects going on that haven't been sort of scaled up or thought about in the system level yet. And we're actually funding a number of them, and I'm happy to sort of talk about that in discussion, but what I want to talk about right now is what we know at the summative level, what we know at the aggregate level. We don't know a whole lot about things like critical thinking. We have pilot tested the CLA in Ontario for some logistics, some cultural and political reasons. It didn't go very well. That has not a lot to do with the CLA. It has more to do with how we're logistically set up as a university and college system. But the CLA, for those of you who don't know, is the Collegiate Learning Assessment. It's a standardized test for critical thinking. But what we do know is as follows. We know the PAC just came out Daniel referred to this before. For those of you who don't know, the PEAC is the OECD International Literacy Test. It tests literacy, numeracy, and problem solving in technology-rich environments. We didn't do so well. We are below for university graduates 25 to 34. In numeracy, we're below the OECD average, and Ontario is below the Canadian average. Just slightly, but still below. This is the same thing for college graduates 25 to 34. Again, Canada is below the OECD average, by a little bit more, and Ontario is below the Canada average. This is for literacy. This is college graduates 25 to 34. Again, Canada is below the OECD average. We're a little bit, we're more below in numeracy than we are in literacy, but we're still below the average. And Ontario is just at the average for college graduates 25 to 34 in literacy, and this is for universities. Again, below Ontario, woohoo, 1 point above the Canada average on literacy for university graduates. Still not that great. Problem solving in technology-rich environments, we don't do very well. We're still below the OECD average for both university graduates and for college graduates. And this is Ontario over here, right at the Canadian average. So measuring literacy in Canada. So the other way that we can look at this is we can look at it longitudinally, right? Because we've had 3 international literacy tests. 1994 was the first IELTS. 2003 was the second IELTS, and PEAC was in 2013. PEAC added problem solving in technology-rich environments. That was a significant difference. There are other differences as well, but that's a significant difference. So let's look at how we do over time. I'm going to tell you it's not good. We're going down. So level 4 and 5 are the 2 highest literacy levels. And I'll tell you in a minute what they mean. But what you see is that for Canada, we've declined from about 23% of population, adult population, 16 to 65, having level 4 and 5, down to about 20% for the second IELTS in 2003, down to 14% of adults in Canada having level 4 or 5 literacy levels. So I'll tell you what that actually means. 4. Tasks involve multiple steps to find solutions to abstract problems. Tasks require the ability to integrate and synthesize multiple pieces of information from lengthy or complex passages and to make inferences from that information. One would assume that this is what a university or college graduate should be able to do. 16 to 65-year-old adults, only just below 15% have that level of literacy proficiency in Canada, and it's going down. So, going back to 15-year-olds that did Pisa, we do actually pretty well in Pisa. I know that the results aren't as good this time around as they have been in the past, but we still do pretty well. Unfortunately, when we get to PEAC, we do worse. So what the red indicates is that in all of those areas, and this is in numeracy, we have decreased from our Pisa to our PEAC scores, right, in those provinces. So as you'll see in Ontario, we've decreased in numeracy from Pisa to PEAC. Same thing with literacy. A couple of provinces have increased their levels. A couple of provinces increase in literacy and decrease in numeracy, or the other way around. In Ontario, we've decreased in both. Which means that our literacy and numeracy levels are lower in our adults than they are in our 15-year-olds. So what does that mean? I mean, it's bad, but what does it mean? Pisa is a fairly good predictor of whether or not people complete high school, go on to post-secondary, and complete post-secondary. So increases in math scores on Pisa are positively associated with high school completion and attending post-secondary. finding is more pronounced for males. Talk about that in a second. In the reading scores, increases in reading scores are positively associated with high school completion and attending post-secondary. There is something going on in post-secondary with men. We are losing boys. Not entirely sure how it's happening, but it's happening. There are a lot of theories, there's a lot of, it's not my area, but this is interesting. So bridging. Let me make a little bit of a plea for thinking about the K-12 sector and the post-secondary sector together. It's the same students. It's the same people. But we have two very different siloed cultures, right? K-12, we even use different language. So we don't use cognitive skill language in post-secondary when we talk about learning outcomes and core competencies. But in terms of making the sort of that pathway from K-12 to post-secondary, what we're seeing is in the last, since the double cohort, so since we got rid of grade 13 in Ontario, we have increased the number of seats in post-secondary education in Ontario by 130,000 students. That's huge, right? Partially because of the double cohort, but in large part because this government has had an access agenda. They have actually paid for increased enrollment in universities and colleges. They've done that because they believed in a larger amount of access for Ontario students. But what that means is that 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when your average student in post-secondary education, especially in university, was 18 to 24, right out of high school, middle class, middle income, didn't have a disability, wasn't Aboriginal, parents went to post-secondary education, that is no longer the average student, right? The students now, the student demographic profile is very different now. Students need a lot more support. I'm going to show you how this plays out in university and college. This is university participation. The blue line is average participation. So average participation, university is about 45% of all participation. Right? So the dark blue line, the peaks are students with parents over 100K, who make over 100K, women, urban, first generation immigrant, it's interesting, very, very high university participation, no disability, and the valleys, the dips, Aboriginal, low income, first generation students, students whose parents don't have any post-secondary, do not go to university. Whoops, wrong way. They go to college. All right. So college students, Aboriginal students go to college, first generation students go to college, low income students go to college, rural students go to college. This is where students need a lot of support, right? And we do no service to students by having two separate systems that don't talk to each other. So there's a lot of, I don't know if you hear this in the K-12 sector, I'm assuming you do. In the post-secondary sector, there's a lot of blaming. There's a lot of blame game, right? Which is, it's not our problem, they weren't prepared when they got here. And on the other hand, there's the K-12. Our job is to graduate from high school. After that, it's not our problem. That doesn't do any service to the students who actually need to make that leap between the two sectors. And the students who are making the leap between the two sectors are increasingly students who need support. So it's not obviously all solved by having the same language and having the same and communicating with the same types of competencies and learning outcomes, but that's a step, certainly. Agreeing on what the skills are that students need to go all the way through the two systems, and then being clear about how we teach those skills, how we map those skills to the curriculum, and I'm talking about generic skills, and then how we assess those skills. So I'm going to leave you with something that Jamie Marasotis at the Lumina Foundation in the United States said he works a lot on this issue of post-secondary education dropout. Huge in the States. Some places it's worse than 50% attrition. And very often that affects the most vulnerable populations, right? At the same time, they're paying more and more for post-secondary education. So there's a real push in the United States to try to find a way of articulating value for education and try to express that value to the students who need it the most. And this is what he said about having the two sectors talk to each other. He said, what we need is a system in which the exit standards for one sector align with the entrance requirements of the next, one in which students' pathways are clearly defined and reasonably straight. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
I think one of the objectives that we want to accomplish here today is the opening of the communication among the different sectors, higher education, the K-12 sectors, the neuroscience sectors, the education sectors, that there's a lot of value that each of these groups can contribute mutually. Is there anything that you heard with regard to the cognitive realm, right, in the cognitive realm, that you think may be representative? And maybe one of the questions I have in particular with regards to the OECD studies is, do we have a higher percentage of special needs students in our system that may skew our numbers downward as a result? And really, if we normalized across different geographic populations, we would have better outcomes?
Well, I have two answers. The first is, when I was listening this morning, one of the things that I was struck by, and I'm glad you gave me a chance to talk about this a little bit. We've done a lot of research at HEQCO into the growing number of students with disability in the post-secondary system. Institutions all struggle with how to support those students. You probably have heard the I don't know if you have, but you may have read the reports of the puppy rooms in Queens, and this is the idea that you can go and sort of spend some time with puppies that will lessen your stress level and lessen your and it sounds a little bit it sounds a little bit silly, but in fact institutions are really struggling with the number of students who need special supports. Learning disabilities, mental health disabilities, physical disabilities. There is an enormous amount of work being done in both the universities and colleges in just trying to figure out how best to support these students. Sort of traditional centers for students with disabilities don't always work. There's a huge stigma around going to those centers. Very often a student who's been wonderfully supported throughout their high school experience, getting into post-secondary, suddenly they're away from home, they don't have the same supports, they don't have the same people around them who are sort of helping them with independent learning plans and that sort of thing. It can be a huge shock to the system. So I don't think anybody has actually sort of worked that out in terms of how to, but it's one area where I would suggest that it makes an enormous amount of sense for the two sectors to be talking to each other, because that is it's a harder leap between K-12 and post-secondary for a student with a disability than for a lot of other students. So that's one thing. I don't have any solutions, I just wanted to make it. And then in terms of the PIAC, everybody is sort of, in my sector, everybody's sort of throwing theories at the wall right now in terms of why the PIAC scores are lower than the Pisa scores. One possibility is that we, especially in Ontario, have very, very high adult immigration rates, right? You're talking about people who are taking the test in their second language. You're talking to people who went through a different education system. So university and college, yes, but from a different system. I don't know if that's the answer, but that's the one I'm hearing the most in people who are sort of digging into this stuff and looking at why our rates are going down. But one way or another, it's still problematic.
to Singapore. It sounds like they have integrated, they've looked at the neuroscience and the education together and are trying to bring together the best of both worlds. What we're kind of seeing is that there is value. Is that something that translates here? And if we do get involved early, is there a better possibility for outcomes that will increase the confidence levels, cognitive levels, the performance levels, and the outcomes as we move forward?
I think most people would agree if we start early, whether it's building core competencies, building in kindness, building in any of this at an earlier age. Certainly, I think supporting the kids at an earlier age is going to help those developmental trajectories later on. I think in Singapore the difference is it's a much smaller community, and they certainly have a mix of integrated schools and schools that are specifically for kids who don't fit well into an integrated system. So there's certainly other issues and other models there, but I do agree. I think I think to your point where you were saying, and I think it's to the gentleman's point earlier, lots of everybody, all kids have struggles with some of these transitions, but when we're thinking about kids with special learning needs or disabilities, as you had said, that leap is even that much harder, and really recognizing the extra supports that are needed for those kids is really important.
How did Singapore do in the OECD? Do you know how Singapore did? I seem to recall in the Global Mail piece, Singapore did very, very well.
Right.
Yeah, and obviously, they're a little forward thinking in how they remediate.
Right.
So there is a direct impact in how you look at the remediation and at the overall success of kids and outcomes overall.
I just want to say one more thing about that, and then there is quite the cottage industry in trying to figure out why people do well in PIAC and why people, and same thing with Pisa, right? There's the OECD and StatsCan will be putting out a series of thematic reports over the next 6 months or so, and they'll be sort of addressing a number of those issues. So if those are the sorts of things you're interested in, look for those thematic reports.
So I'm Fiona Deller, and I'm actually, I just need to point out I'm not from the educational community, but I am a voice out of the... Sorry. So my voice actually and my perspective comes from the commercial side and the voice of industry actually. I came here because I'm hugely interested in core competencies, because ultimately, even for, let's just call it special needs or disenfranchised, everybody ultimately needs employment. So I'm coming at it from that perspective. So this is more a comment than anything. Your quote from the Lumina Foundation really resonates with me, because there's the same disconnect that you're talking about between the K-12 and the post-secondary exists between industry and education. Mm-hmm. And I speak again from watching folks be unemployed, underemployed, overly unemployed. These are issues that I think come back ultimately to the education, and this conversation is then hugely important to get out there to industry. And I know I'm just a lone voice in this room, but it's fascinating what is going on, and I applaud all of you. And I think, though, that the conversation has to be broadened.
I would actually, so just on that, you might be interested. The Lumina, we started our tuning project, the one that I described earlier, based on some of the things that Lumina did. And we weren't able to do everything they did, but one of the things they did that we found fascinating was when they put their discipline tables together with faculty, they added students, alumni, and employers. And they said, do these core competencies make sense to you? Do they make sense to the students who are currently in the program in terms of the way that they're articulated? That was huge to us, so we included students as well. They asked graduates who were in the labor market looking for jobs, are these the core competencies and learning outcomes that resonate with you in terms of what you think you learned and got out of this? and they asked employers, are these the core competencies that you're looking for in this particular discipline? And so it was acknowledging that point exactly, that it's not just, the time that you're in post-secondary isn't just a finite sort of 2 or 4 years that only involves the faculty and the student and that's it, and then you leave and then it's another life altogether. It's a continuum, right? So it's a continuum from K to 12 into post-secondary and then into whatever you do with the rest of your life, including retraining and upgrading and all of that kind of stuff.
I wonder if you could put up your polar ice cap figures again that showed about the underrepresentation.
Oh,
yes.
The spider graphs.
Yes, I think spider graphs. It looks to me like the shrinking of the polar caps. But so were there 2 of these? Yes, that one. I just need that one up for a couple of seconds. And
That's
the
university.
difference between, yes, so the first one is university, the second one is college.
College,
Yes,
that's right.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yes.
I wonder if Sylvain, if you mind talking a little bit about smarter kids as an early intervention with kids 3 to 6 years old, and the role of music actually in improving cognitive skills. Because there's been a lot of discussion here about attention, IQ, reading ability, and the research that Sylvain has done is really the first example, I think, of showing real transfer. So, especially in this age where we're taking music and these enrichment areas out of the curriculum and not paying for them because we want to teach to the test, something's being lost.
It's related to all this kind of question and to the talk of Daniel a little bit earlier. Is the idea that we work with in my lab is really like, how can we understand curriculum in a way that we can improve these kind of core skills. I work with very early, childhood, so from 0 to 10, and mainly the program that Martika is talking about is a program for like pre-kindergarten and kindergarten. So the idea was like, how can we really find a way for the kids to learn skills that they can transfer on their core academic skills, so which is reading, language, attention. And along the way we found out that one of the best way to do it is for them to have fun.
Such a shock.
I think it sounds funny like that, but I really think the problem that we are talking about is like the problem is a fundamental problem in our culture. Like, we need achievers. We don't need learners. We need achievers, right? Yeah. So and that's come with the fact that every kid has to perform at this moment. And like one of our solutions in my lab was to create softwares, because the softwares allow a plasticity for the child. So the software can adapt to the performance of the child and to how fast he can learn. But also the software helps the teacher to recenter the child at the center of the educational process and not focus on what do I have to say now? What is the next hour of teaching? I don't remember what is the exercise that I saw about yesterday night? But with having the program embedded in the software, you can focus on what is the problem of the child right now. And for example, let the child that has no problem continue with the software and the lesson and don't stop the classroom. What we found is we test different ways, and very global. I tried I tried a bit at the earlier time in my career mathematics. I tried language. I tried music. But music was I found the way where the kids really don't feel they're learning. Don't even feel that at school or anywhere. It's just it's just very, very engaging. And that's based process on they want to come back and they want to have more, which also helps all this kind of function of learning that Daniel was talking about, working memory, attention. And our results show some very, very, very fast changes. So we measure the behavioral performance and the neural mechanism, and we see changes in matters of like 16 hours in the brain of the child. We see improvement in IQ, and like we see these kind of transferable skills that they can do better in other setup. They can do better in other type of tests that they were trained on. And also like something that we observing with what you are a little bit referring to is as soon as we are able to train this kind of executive function core, which is really what the neuroeducation field is talking about right now, we see that there is this kind of confidence in earlier ages, because with the very young you cannot really ask them this kind of question, but with older ages we see that they feel confident, they feel something change in their life, they can take on more challenges, and the funny stuff, it didn't depend on their profile before. So there was not the smarter kids who did even better, or like the very lower IQs who did better. So there is something also about this cognitive executive function system that seems to be, and I'm careful when I use these kind of terms because our understanding of it is very low or very weak, is a kind of domain general process. So right now, for example, some of our programs have been adopted by the Toronto Catholic School Board, being part of their core curriculum in kindergarten, and so they are running with like software in their classroom, and it is working really well. And like actually, like a lot of teachers' feedback were like, "Oh, this changed my class. It changed the way I interact with my student, where like I'm a partner in their education." So it kind of like give like a friendship, relationship type of that put the group forward instead of like some of the kids.
Yeah, I mean, so I find that fascinating. Just say a couple of things in reaction to that. I don't know anything about pedagogy at the K-12 level. What I do know is that at the post-secondary level, some of the more interesting conversations that are happening around generic core competencies and learning outcomes is the change in pedagogy. Because when you start talking about things like entrepreneurship, I see Mars, entrepreneurship, innovation, creativity, curiosity, you start to realize that a lot of that stuff is antithetical to the way that we sometimes teach. Failure is important for something like entrepreneurship. How do you actually fail well in the post-secondary system, that kind of thing. But also I wanted to just tell an anecdote. I was talking before about how when we name the core competencies, we almost always come up with the same set. There's a saturation point of about 6 or 7. The only time I've seen a different set of core competencies and learning outcomes that was significantly different from the ones that we usually see was when OCAD put theirs together. And they had such a different focus. They had such a focus on emotional EQ, emotional quotient, and creativity in a very, very different way, and integration, community integration, and core competencies that were very different than the ones that we usually talk about. I just thought it was interesting in terms of how they think about the way that you teach art, for instance.
To the neuroscientists out there, is there anything about the minds of children is fundamentally different than the minds of children of yesterday, and that our education system should be informed of with reference to perhaps the number of stimuli that our children have and its effect on their brain and their brain development? I mean, just look at the CP24 screen. There's 5 different screens on the CP24 screen that we're intended to keep attention to. Obviously our brain is different than when I was growing up. It was a billboard and didn't move. So we live in a different time. Is there anything cognitively, developmentally, maybe even biologically that is impacted by our environment that maybe our education system should be aware of so that we can adapt in that capacity? A loaded question.
Maybe I can answer that a little bit. Like, so we did like a conference yesterday about this kind of idea that we see a generational gap between kids, between the group of 3 to 6 years old right now and the group of 9 to 12 years old right now. So like that's a change that happened. Like it's so fast, and this is mainly due to the technology. So right now, like, you know, like my 3 years old go in front of the TV and try to switch the screen, you know. So there is, you know, there is a lot of like kind of change happening right now that are really deep into how children are part of their own education. You know, so my 3 years old, I mean, a lot of people are like that. Like it's like the, you know, the gift list right now for Santa. So it's like. So I say, oh, what do you want? You want something like, I say, look at like, you know, Power Rangers and like Spider-Man and stuff like that. After I say, and I'd say, well, why don't you look at like a tablet and like that we can do games, you know, like literacy games, numeracy games and stuff like that. You know, I'm like the basic parent, you know, like my kid has to get educated, so I need to find a software that works for him or an app. And they say, no, I'm fine. I have my iPad, which is my iPad, by the way. But he has his games already. He has his like channel on YouTube. He has, so at 3 years old, he has already a content that he's learning through his program. He doesn't want to watch TV anymore. You know, so there is this part of which I'm not sure we know what is it. I'm sure there is change at the brain level. Because what we are trying to do right now is because I run longitudinal study and clinical trial in my lab, we have data from this group of 9 years old that were coming in 2008, 2009 in my lab, and the group of like 3 to 6 years old right now that are tested. So we're going to try to look at that. But there is definitely a huge amount of technology in the home right now that is changing the face of education. So like the kids that are going to enter this year, like in, you know, like junior kindergarten, are going to be very, very different than the kids were there like 5 years ago because of the tablet, because of all the access of the information that they have. Like I was like, maybe for Daniela, maybe you can answer. There was something that shocked me about my kid, and I think that it's not only my kid because I talked to other parents about that. It's like he understands the code on the iPad because he wants to access that so bad, but he learned the numbers of the
educational system. So I think we need to, I'm not going to say that there are adverse effects, but I think we need to maintain a healthy skepticism towards a too great a focus on using technology to deliver information and combine it with collaborative learning. And you know, school is social interactions as well as getting informations into heads.
I just wanted to comment on that really quickly because we do a lot of work on uses of tech in the classroom at the university and college level, and so we do a lot of evaluations around what works in classrooms and what doesn't. We do large classrooms, small classrooms, seminar style, tech in the classroom, that kind of thing. And overwhelmingly, what it comes back to is it's about the teacher. A good teacher can teach with tech, you know, and a bad teacher is still a bad teacher. So tech is just a tool, right? And the pedagogy is about really sort of what you do when you're no longer the primary imparter of information. Because information is easy to come by, how then do you teach? And sometimes that's about tech. We just had a conference recently where somebody made the point, just because it's tech doesn't mean it's innovation, right? Which is very true, but it really is about the teacher. Good tech with a good teacher can actually be very innovative, but it doesn't necessarily have to be.
If I may just react to that by saying there's a beautiful book, maybe you're already aware of it, by John Hattie. He's from an educational researcher from New Zealand, and he did a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. So he collected basically all the studies that are available of what predicts good educational outcomes. And he's absolutely
Good teacher.
resonates with you, it's the teacher, always, across all of these studies. And the other thing I think with technology that we need to bear in mind is that unfortunately not everybody is as careful in working with technology as Sylvain is, who's doing empirical research to actually see, is it valid, is there transfer effect. I think the iTunes store is full of products that claim to train children in literacy and numeracy, and they're not evidence-based. One of the problems in education is we don't have an FDA in education. So the market, market is full of products that make claims that are not substantiated by the kind of evidence that, for example, Sylvain can provide.